the event, she made her trip, and he secured both the release of the Americans and an invitation for an English embassy to Mogador. The invitation, I make no doubt, you gentlemen will recall. Several members murmured their agreement. During his return to Malta, the 14-gun brig which carried Grey and his wife, along with the Americans, Constance, I believe was the vessel's name, was encountered and pursued by the French frigate Fidèle, 32. This was before Amiens, of course. A stern chase ensued. Before a fresh wind took her aback, the Frenchman was able to close within extreme range of her bow chasers. On a rise, Constance was raked at her waterline. Mrs. Grey was then in the cockpit, nursing the emaciated and feverish sailors her husband had rescued. The splinters killed her. It was a bad death. She was the brig's only casualty. In the subsequent months, Captain Grey attempted to resume his duties, but was judged by Admiral Godfrey to be unable, or at least not reliably able, owing— Sir Edward referred now to a letter on the table in front of him— to profound and unshakable melancholia. Godfrey expressed his hopes that Grey's condition would be attended to in England. I arranged to have him seen on Harley Street, but he wrote yesterday from Portsmouth to say he has returned instead to his house in Kent at Sheerness. I intend to see him there tomorrow. Admiral Lord St. Vincent nodded to Sir Edward, who looked around the table to see if anyone else had any questions. The Admiral of the Blue cleared his throat. How long before we have a replacement in Malta? We will have a new man in place there by the end of the month. I am informed that he passed the Nore yesterday, answered Sir Edward. But he continued, the question, though, will we be able to replace Thomas Grey, remains very much up in the air. Chapter 2. Thomas Grey sat in the gardens of his estate, Marsh Downs, surrounded by an assortment of flowering rhododendrons whose specific names he'd never bothered to learn. Now, of course, he never would. They'd been planted by his wife. 200 or 300 yards away, the tide was beginning to turn. The waves breaking on the reedy end of his marsh were beginning to push inward, and soon the birds who stalked the mudflats, looking for worms and snails, would fly inland. He had planned to take 1 or 2 for dinner. A shotgun rested across his lap, and his Irish setter, Fred, rested at his feet. Grey was glad, and frankly somewhat surprised, that the dog remembered him, since Fred had spent the last several years, most of his adult life, as the companion of the Downs gamekeeper, Canfield. Fred seemed sensible of something being wrong. Dogs always are. From time to time he nuzzled Grey's foot, and Grey reached down to scratch his head and neck. The fact was, Grey didn't feel much like shooting anything. Fred would be disappointed, but it couldn't be helped. A walk might answer for an acceptable substitute. Anyway, his housekeeper, Mrs. Hubble, who Grey believed had now recovered from the shock of his unexpected return, had, no doubt, something in mind for him to eat. It wouldn't do to insult her with a fresh kill. He stood up, and Fred stood up with him, wearing a keen, gun-ready look. "Sorry, my boy, not today. Maybe tomorrow." Grey took a final deep breath of the flowers and began a slow walk back towards the house, wondering how Canfield had mustered the will to keep the gardens so neat around an empty house, with no expectation of anyone but himself and Mrs. Hubble seeing them. Before leaving for Malta, thought Grey, he should have opened the gardens to the neighbourhood. What a waste were 3 years of dead blooms that no one had enjoyed. As he walked south, the house rose up over the gardens. It wasn't especially large, but it was, Grey had always thought, unusually striking. Its almost pink brick exterior topped off by a copper roof, tarnished to a beautiful verdigris, set off by creeping, darker yellow-green ivy. He'd bought it with his share of the prize money from a small French fleet captured by his intelligence in 98. 98 was the year he'd been married, his marriage being the reason he'd given up his house in town and moved to a country estate. He'd worried that he'd find himself unable to resume living at the Downs, alone. In fact, being back was the one thing that had given him any comfort. He and Paulette had had no children. Thank God there were no children to worry about. Grey stamped some sand off his feet and stepped into the small stone.